What does space do to the human mind when the familiar world falls away? Not the cinematic version, not the polished language of mission patches and triumphant broadcasts, but the quieter truth. The truth that begins after the launch, after the vibration leaves the bones, after Earth becomes a luminous curve of blue and white suspended in black. Up there, far above weather and nations, astronauts carry instruments, training, and discipline. Yet they also carry something less measurable: memory, expectation, fear, wonder, and sometimes, in that thin frontier between knowledge and perception, they encounter things that refuse to settle neatly into explanation. For as long as human beings have looked upward, the sky has been both map and mirror. We chart it with mathematics, then fill its silence with questions. Spaceflight was supposed to narrow that gap. It gave us cameras sharper than the eye, sensors more patient than the hand, machines that could translate darkness into data. And still, even now, the cosmos remains a place where certainty flickers. A light appears where no light should be. A shadow moves against logic. A sound enters a headset from nowhere anyone can name. The official record calls such moments anomalies, artifacts, distortions. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is not. This is not a story about proving the impossible. It is a story about standing at the edge of the known and admitting how much remains unsettled. In orbit, the laws of physics still hold, but human experience changes shape. Distance feels different. Time loosens. The line between an external mystery and an internal one can become almost invisible. So we begin here, with the men and women who left Earth expecting silence and found something stranger. Not monsters, not answers, but fragments of uncertainty drifting through the dark. And perhaps that has always been the deeper meaning of exploration. We do not travel outward only to conquer the unknown. We go to discover how much of it still lives within us. It started with a point of light that should not have been there. Outside the capsule window, beyond the layered reflections of glass and instrument panels, something moved against the dark with a patience that felt almost deliberate. The astronaut watching it had trained for mechanical failures, orbital debris, the ordinary surprises of a mission, but not for the strange intimacy of seeing an object pace the spacecraft like a silent companion. In the early decades of human spaceflight, crews often entered environments where technology was still catching up to experience. Cameras missed what the eye noticed. Telemetry could describe motion, but not mood. A pilot might report a bright shape, a drifting form, a flash that seemed to respond to the craft itself. On the ground, engineers searched for rational causes: frozen fuel particles, sunlight striking metal, pieces of insulation turning slowly through vacuum. Most of the time, those answers were persuasive. Space is full of ways to mislead the senses without breaking any laws of nature, and yet the emotional power of such moments lingered. To float above Earth and witness an unexplained light is not like seeing one from a field or a city street. In orbit, there is no comforting horizon, no trees, no wind, no familiar scale. A tiny glimmer can feel immense, simply because there is nothing else around it. The mind, deprived of ordinary reference points, begins to listen differently to what the eyes are trying to say. This is where space exploration becomes more than engineering. It becomes a study in perception itself. What do we truly see when we are stripped of context? How much of reality depends on the frame around it? The object outside the window may have been nothing more than debris catching the sun, but the deeper story lies in the moment before explanation arrived, when a trained observer faced the unknown and had to sit with it. That pause matters. It reminds us that discovery is not born only from answers. Sometimes it begins with the discomfort of not yet having one, and with the humility to keep looking into the dark. What if the strangest thing in space was not what astronauts saw, but what they heard? Inside a spacecraft, sound is supposed to obey clear rules. Vibrations travel through metal walls, fans hum, switches click, voices arrive through radios, coded and controlled. Every noise has a source, or at least it should. And yet there have been moments when crews reported something else. Tones, knocks, faint music like pulses, sounds that seem to rise from the structure itself, as if the vessel were briefly becoming an instrument no one meant to play. In space, silence is a kind of illusion. Vacuum carries no sound, but spacecraft are never truly quiet. They are dense with systems, circulating air, electrical currents, tiny expansions and contractions as sunlight gives way to shadow. A hull, cooling after heat, can pop softly like winter wood in a fire. Antennas and wiring can create interference that brushes the ear with something almost musical. The body, suspended in microgravity, grows unusually attentive to such details. Without gravity's constant pressure, even awareness seems to drift closer to the skin. For astronauts, unexplained sound can be more unsettling than unexplained light. A light may remain outside, distant and abstract. A sound feels intimate. It enters the body. It suggests nearness. It asks to be interpreted. Ground teams have often found practical explanations after the fact. Radio bleed, structural resonance, thermal stress, the hidden choreography of machines doing exactly what they were built to do. Still, before the explanation comes, the experience can feel oddly alive, as though the craft were whispering in a language made of pressure and metal. These moments reveal something essential about exploration. We imagine the unknown as something waiting out there in the vastness, but sometimes it emerges from the tools we trust most. The spacecraft that protects human life can also become a source of mystery, reminding its crew that complexity has its own hidden music. Perhaps that is part of the cost of going farther. The farther we travel from the natural sounds of Earth, the more closely we begin to hear the fragile architecture that carries us. And in that listening, we are forced to ask a quiet question. When the machine speaks, are we hearing a malfunction, a pattern, or simply our own need to make meaning from the noise? Have you ever looked through glass and felt for a split second that the world on the other side was looking back? In orbit, windows are more than windows. They are thresholds between the fragile human habitat and an expanse so large it resists comprehension. Through them, astronauts have watched lightning bloom over continents, cities glitter like neural pathways, and auroras pour across the poles like living curtains. But sometimes, in that flood of beauty, something appears that seems almost impossible to place. There have been reports of shapes moving beneath or beyond the spacecraft with an unsettling grace, dark forms crossing a star field, flashes that seem too structured to be random, reflections that arrive with such precision they feel external. In many cases, the explanation is beautifully ordinary. Window layers can create phantom images. Interior lights can bounce across curved surfaces. A glove, a checklist, a floating tool can turn into an apparition when seen at the wrong angle against the night. Human vision, remarkable as it is, was not designed for weightlessness, extreme contrast, and the endless black of space. Yet the experience itself can be deeply affecting. The astronaut at the window is not only observing, they are suspended between inside and outside, safety and exposure, knowledge and uncertainty. On Earth, our eyes are trained by landscapes, distances, shadows we understand. In orbit, those habits begin to fail. A reflection can masquerade as a visitor. A familiar optical effect can feel like a message from beyond the frame. This is not evidence of the supernatural. It is evidence of how perception bends under extraordinary conditions. And that may be just as profound. Space does not merely confront astronauts with distant worlds. It quietly rearranges the act of seeing itself. The question, then, is not whether every mystery hides a dramatic answer. More often, it does not. The deeper question is why the mind reaches so quickly toward meaning when the image before it slips free of context. Perhaps wonder begins there, in the instant when sight loses its certainty and becomes, once again, a form of searching. What happens when Earth itself becomes the most astonishing thing an astronaut sees? Not a distant mystery, not a flicker in the void, but the home world transformed by distance into something almost unrecognizable. From orbit, the planet does not feel solid in the way it does from the ground. It feels delicate, thin, wrapped in a fragile wash of atmosphere that looks, from certain angles, less like protection than like a brief and vanishing breath. Many astronauts have described this shift with a kind of reverence that borders on disbelief. Oceans lose their names and become fields of shifting light. Borders disappear completely. Storms spiral with terrible elegance, beautiful and indifferent at once. Wildfire smoke stretches across continents like a bruise. At night, cities glow in branching constellations, evidence of human ambition written against darkness. The familiar world returns as something both intimate and strange, a place known too well and not well enough. This vision has often been called transformative, but that word can sound too clean for what it really means. The change is not only awe, it is also disorientation. To see Earth whole is to feel, sometimes all at once, pride, grief, gratitude, and vulnerability. Astronauts speak of the overview effect, yet the phrase hardly captures the emotional weight of realizing that every war, every love story, every language, every forgotten life has unfolded within that thin blue boundary. From far away, human history looks both immense and heartbreakingly small. Perhaps this is one of the quiet paradoxes of spaceflight. We leave Earth in order to understand the cosmos, and instead we return with a deeper awareness of home. The alien landscape is not always out there. Sometimes it is our own planet, seen clearly for the first time. And maybe that is why this vision lingers long after missions end. The greatest revelation of space may not be that the universe is vast. We already suspected that. It may be that our little world, so noisy and divided from within, appears from the outside as a single, luminous miracle, brief, borderless, and impossibly worth protecting. What if the body itself became one of the strangest frontiers in space? Astronauts leave Earth carrying years of training, but once they enter orbit, the body begins to renegotiate nearly every rule it has ever known. Up and down lose their authority. Fluids drift upward, changing pressure in the head and softening the face into a look many crews recognize instantly in one another. Muscles wait for resistance that never comes. Even sleep, that most ordinary surrender, becomes an unfamiliar act. Some of the most unsettling experiences astronauts describe are not external at all. They are internal, quiet, and deeply personal. A hand released in midair does not fall, and the nervous system must learn not to expect it to. The inner ear, built to interpret gravity, suddenly offers conflicting messages. The result can be nausea, dizziness, or a strange feeling that the body has become unmoored from itself. One astronaut may feel as if the ceiling is the floor. Another may wake in darkness, unsure which way their own body is turned. These are not failures of discipline. They are reminders that human perception evolved for one planet and one planet only. And yet adaptation comes. The body, vulnerable as it is, also reveals a remarkable flexibility. Crews learn to move with fingertip precision, to trust visual cues over instinct, to build a new physical language in an environment that first feels impossible. Space does not simply expose weakness. It reveals resilience, though never without cost. There is something humbling in this. We often imagine exploration as a triumph of machines and willpower, but each mission is also a negotiation with biology. The farther humans travel, the more clearly we see that discovery is not only about distant landscapes. It is about understanding the fragile vessel through which every landscape is experienced. Perhaps that is why these physical dislocations matter beyond science. They remind us that certainty lives in the body as much as in the mind, and when gravity disappears, even briefly, we are forced to confront a deeper truth. Much of what feels permanent in human life is, in fact, a beautifully maintained balance. What does danger look like in space before it has a name? Sometimes it arrives not as a dramatic explosion or a blaring alarm, but as a brief glint, a tiny fracture of light, moving far too fast to fully see. Space is not empty. It is threaded with fragments, paint flecks, metal shards, spent hardware, remnants of missions long finished. Each piece drifts through orbit with a speed that turns even something no larger than a grain into a serious threat. For astronauts, this is one of the most haunting realities of leaving Earth. The beauty of orbit exists alongside an invisible field of risk. A window can bear the scar of a microscopic impact. A station module can require shielding not against storms or predators, but against the debris of human ambition. Every launch adds wonder to the sky, and also, in some measure, vulnerability. We do not enter a pristine wilderness. We enter a frontier already marked by our presence. There is a melancholy in that fact. The same species that built instruments precise enough to leave the planet also scattered traces of itself into the dark. Some fragments are harmless, some carefully tracked, some too small to monitor until they announce themselves with damage. In this sense, orbit becomes a kind of mirror. It reflects not only ingenuity, but consequence. Even beyond Earth, we remain responsible for what we leave behind. And yet, astronauts continue to work there, floating inside laboratories and stations that depend on constant vigilance. Their courage is not rooted in ignoring the danger. It lies in understanding it clearly and moving forward anyway. This, too, is part of exploration, not the fantasy of untouched discovery, but the disciplined effort to inhabit a realm where beauty and hazard are inseparable. Perhaps that is the more mature vision of the future, not one in which technology frees us from consequence, but one in which it asks us to become more accountable, more careful, more aware of the worlds we enter. In space, even the smallest fragment can change everything. The question is whether we will learn to treat the unknown with wonder alone, or with responsibility equal to our reach. Can a sunrise become mysterious simply by happening too often? On Earth, dawn feels gradual, almost ceremonial. In orbit, It comes rushing. Astronauts can witness multiple sunrises and sunsets in a single day, each one abrupt and almost unreal, as the spacecraft slips from darkness into a blade of light. The transition is so quick, so clean, that it can feel less like weather and more like a cosmic switch being flipped. These moments are among the most beautiful in space, but also among the most disorienting. The sun does not rise through atmosphere the way it does from a field or a shoreline. Instead, light breaks across the edge of Earth in sharp layers, a thin blue line, then bands of gold, violet, and white, all suspended over the black curve of the planet. Shadows vanish instantly. Surfaces ignite with brightness. For an astronaut at the window, the experience can feel almost supernatural, not because it defies science, but because it reveals science with overwhelming clarity. Yet repeated exposure changes the meaning of time itself. Morning stops being a daily promise and becomes a recurring event without the familiar rhythm of waking life. The body may follow mission clocks, but the senses are witnessing a different order altogether. Day and night no longer mark labor and rest in the ancient human pattern. They become orbital facts, detached from the slower emotional tempo that shaped generations on Earth. This can create a subtle loneliness. The crew lives by schedules, procedures, and checklists, but outside the window, the universe moves to a scale that makes those routines feel provisional. Every sunrise is beautiful, yet also slightly estranging. It reminds the observer that what feels fixed at home is often just habit wrapped around a rotating world. And maybe that is why these repeated dawns stay in memory. They do more than inspire awe. They loosen our grip on ordinary time. They suggest that human life is measured not only by clocks and calendars, but by moments when the familiar world returns in a new form. How many truths, we might ask, are hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to see them under a different light? What if the most difficult distance in space was not between planets, but between people and everything they have ever known? Long before a mission ends, separation begins its quiet work. Earth is visible from orbit but untouchable. Home becomes an image on a screen, a voice delayed by static, a memory carried into sleep. For astronauts, this may be one of the least visible and most profound experiences of spaceflight. The emotional weight of being near the world, yet utterly removed from it. In photographs, spacecraft can appear orderly, almost serene. Inside them, life is disciplined and crowded, shaped by routines that leave little room for private unraveling. Meals are scheduled, experiments continue, systems must be checked. But beneath that structure, the mind keeps its own weather. A crew member may glance at a continent drifting below and think not of science, but of a kitchen table, a parent growing older, a child changing in small ways no camera can fully capture. In orbit, absence becomes strangely vivid. Psychologists and mission planners understand this well. Isolation is not a side effect of space travel. It is one of its defining conditions. Even in a shared habitat, loneliness can take unexpected forms. There is the loneliness of distance, of missing familiar voices and smells. But there is also the loneliness of experience itself, the awareness that what you are seeing cannot be fully translated for anyone who has remained on Earth. Wonder, too, can isolate. Some visions are so large they make language feel painfully small, and yet this separation can deepen connection in unexpected ways. Many astronauts return speaking more tenderly about ordinary life, as though distance restored the value of what routine had hidden. A conversation, a tree moving in wind, rain on a window, the weight of a loved one's hand. These become not minor details, but central truths. Perhaps that is the hidden exchange of exploration. To leave home is to see it more clearly, but clarity arrives with ache. Space expands human perspective, yes, but it also asks a deeply human question. What is the value of discovery if it does not return us, in some form, to one another? What if the hardest thing to understand in space was not what astronauts saw in the moment, but what remained afterward? Memory is often treated as a reliable archive, especially among people trained to observe carefully under pressure. Yet space has a way of altering recollection. The event itself may last only seconds, a light, a sound, a movement at the edge of vision, but its meaning can keep changing for years, shaped by retellings, transcripts, technical reviews, and the quiet work of the mind trying to organize what it once could not explain. This is part of why stories from orbit acquire such a strange afterlife. A crew member reports something unusual. Engineers search the data. Historians revisit the account decades later. Audiences, hearing only fragments, often lean toward extremes, either absolute belief or immediate dismissal. But the truth is usually more delicate. Human memory is not a machine. It is interpretive, emotional, alive. It preserves atmosphere as much as detail. It remembers how a moment felt and then slowly rebuilds what it thinks it saw. That does not make these accounts worthless. In many ways, it makes them more human. Space exploration depends on measurements, yes, but it also depends on testimony. The lived experience of astronauts matters precisely because it reminds us that every mission is filtered through consciousness. Data can tell us velocity, altitude, temperature, timing. It cannot fully capture the shock of seeing an unexplained flash above the horizon, or the private unease of hearing something in the walls of a ship at 3 in the morning. So the mystery is not only out there in the dark, it also lives in the act of remembering. What survives a mission is never just the event. It is the interpretation, the uncertainty, the story shaped by distance and time. And perhaps that is fitting. Exploration has always been passed from one generation to another through imperfect human memory. The question, then, is not whether memory sometimes distorts. Of course it does. The more searching question is what those distortions reveal, not about the universe alone, but about the way human beings carry wonder, fear, and meaning long after the moment itself has disappeared. What if the last frontier is not a place we reach, but a humility we learn? By the time an astronaut has spent days or months in orbit, the extraordinary no longer arrives only as surprise. It settles into routine. A sunrise becomes part of the workday. Earth turning below becomes background. Even risk, carefully managed, becomes woven into habit. And yet beneath that adaptation remains a quieter realization. Space does not yield itself completely. No matter how advanced the mission, no matter how refined the instruments. This may be the most enduring lesson carried back from orbit. For all our precision, human beings remain interpreters inside an immense and only partly understood reality. We can calculate trajectories to astonishing accuracy. We can dock machines traveling thousands of miles an hour. We can keep people alive in a vacuum that would erase them in seconds. But we still encounter moments that resist immediate translation. A visual anomaly, a sensation the body cannot classify, a memory that grows stranger with time instead of clearer. Mastery in space is always accompanied by mystery. There is something deeply mature in that balance. Modern culture often speaks as though knowledge should eliminate wonder, as though explanation and awe cannot survive together. Spaceflight suggests the opposite. The better we understand the mechanics, the more astonishing the experience becomes. To know exactly why the atmosphere glows does not make it less beautiful. To identify a strange light as debris does not make the original moment less haunting. Explanation can steady us without emptying the world of meaning. And so the story turns inward again. The impossible things astronauts have seen may not all remain impossible. Many can be traced, measured, understood. But the larger significance lies elsewhere. It lies in what these moments reveal about the human encounter with the unknown. Our tendency to search, to imagine, to fear, to question, and then to keep looking. Perhaps that is what makes exploration worthy of us. Not the fantasy that we will banish uncertainty forever, but the willingness to meet it with discipline, curiosity, and grace. In the end, the cosmos may offer no final reassurance, only a larger horizon and the invitation to approach it honestly. What if the strangest encounters in space are really encounters with scale, not with creatures or omens, but with proportions so immense that the mind struggles to keep its footing? In orbit, astronauts look down on mountain ranges that once defined civilizations and see them reduced to texture. They look outward at darkness so deep that even the busiest spacecraft seems like a drifting thought. In such a place, size becomes unstable. The enormous can seem fragile. The tiny can become overwhelming. This change in scale reshapes more than vision. It alters judgment, emotion, even identity. A single droplet of water floating through a cabin becomes mesmerizing. A thin panel of glass stands between life and vacuum. A station, assembled through decades of labor and international effort, can appear against Earth as delicate as a line drawn in air. Space strips away the illusions of permanence that Earth allows us to keep. It shows how much human survival depends on narrow margins, careful systems, and a shared faith that small things done correctly will keep the vastness outside at bay. At the same time, scale can produce a kind of moral clarity. Seen from orbit, the dramas of Earth do not disappear, but they are recontextualized. The storms are larger than cities. The atmosphere is thinner than instinct suggests. The world itself appears finite, in a way that is intellectually obvious on the ground, yet emotionally distant. In space, that fact becomes immediate. Human life is not separate from its environment. It is held by it, quietly and completely. Perhaps this is why so many astronauts return speaking less about conquest and more about stewardship. Once scale has rearranged your thinking, dominance begins to seem like the wrong metaphor. The universe is not a stage built for human certainty. It is a setting in which fragility and magnificence coexist. And maybe that is the lesson hidden inside these impossible sights. The cosmos does not always reveal itself through dramatic revelations. Sometimes it teaches by changing the measure of things, by making us feel all at once smaller than we imagined and more responsible than we knew. What if, after every anomaly is logged and every mystery reduced as far as reason can take it, something essential still remains unresolved? By this point in the journey, the pattern is clear. The impossible in space is rarely a single event. It is a collision between human expectation and a reality too vast, too unfamiliar, too delicately perceived to fit our first explanations. A light becomes debris, a sound becomes resonance. A vision becomes reflection, and yet none of these answers fully erases the emotional truth of the moment in which it first appeared. That emotional truth matters because astronauts do not travel into space as detached instruments. They go as human beings, carrying stories, instincts, memories, and the ancient habit of looking into darkness and asking what might be there. Spaceflight may be modern, but the deeper experience is old. It belongs to sailors crossing unknown seas, to desert travelers reading stars, to anyone who has stood at the edge of a map and felt knowledge thinning into wonder. The setting changes. The human response does not. In this way, the most extraordinary things astronauts have seen are not merely episodes of curiosity. They are reminders that exploration is always double-sided. One frontier lies outside us, in the measurable universe of matter, motion, and light. The other lies within, in the mind that interprets what it encounters and struggles to live honestly beside uncertainty. We are drawn to the stars not only because they are far away, but because they reveal how unfinished our understanding still is. And so this chapter closes not with a final revelation, but with a gathering of threads. The impossible is often a temporary name, a placeholder for what has not yet been understood. But mystery is something larger. It is the atmosphere around all human knowing, the quiet acknowledgement that even in an age of instruments, there will always be moments when wonder outruns explanation. Perhaps that is not a weakness in our search, but its deepest strength. We keep going because the universe is intelligible enough to invite us forward and mysterious enough to keep us humble as we move through it. So where does all of this leave us? After the lights, the sounds, the altered horizons, the drifting doubts. Perhaps here, with a quieter understanding of what it means to be human in a universe that does not explain itself all at once. The stories astronauts bring back are often described as encounters with the impossible, but most are really encounters with limits of perception, of language, of memory, of the frameworks we use to make sense of experience. Space does not merely surround those limits, it illuminates them. And yet that illumination is not bleak. There is dignity in it. To leave Earth, to survive in the narrow shelter of a spacecraft, to witness wonders that strain both science and imagination, and then to return speaking with greater humility rather than greater arrogance. That may be one of the finest things our species has done. Exploration, at its best, is not a declaration of mastery. It is an act of disciplined wonder. It says we are small, we are fragile, and still we choose to look more closely. The impossible things astronauts have seen do not ask us to abandon reason. They ask us to enlarge it, to make room for uncertainty without surrendering to fantasy, to accept explanation when it comes, but also to respect the emotional depth of the moments that came before it. A mystery solved is still a mystery lived. The heart remembers that. Maybe this is the final gift of spaceflight. Not proof of hidden forces or secret truths, but a renewed relationship with the visible world. Earth, seen from afar, becomes more precious. Time, felt against the vastness, becomes more tender. Human life, so brief within the cosmic scale, appears not meaningless but rare, something luminous precisely because it is finite. And so the story ends where all genuine exploration begins, with a question, not an answer. When we look into the dark and find not certainty but reflection, what are we really searching for? Perhaps the future will bring clearer instruments, longer journeys, sharper explanations. But even then, one truth may remain. Beyond every horizon we cross, the universe will continue to ask us not only what we can discover, but who we become in the act of seeking.